feces, and then it smelled like death.
Now remember, when we open this, this is something that we're never going to be able to unsee. Is it a bloodbath in there?
On May 22, 2019, police in Sturgis, Michigan listened to an anonymous 911 caller read them an address. Inside this home, the caller explained, they would find the missing 42-year-old Kelly Jean Warner Miller. Little did authorities know that single phone call would launch the most shocking investigation of their careers, one that required uncovering secret after haunting secret, all buried within an exceptionally twisted and sadistic mind.
Sturgis, Michigan, is the kind of place that people outside the Midwest rarely think about. A small town in St. Joseph County, its streets are lined with modest houses, family-owned businesses, and the kind of familiarity that makes people believe they know their neighbors. Life there moves at a slower rhythm, a mix of industrial grit and rural calm, and for most of its residents, crime is something they read about in the headlines of distant cities, not something that creeps into their own neighborhoods. That sense of small-town security is what made the murder of Kelly Warner by Wade Allen so shocking. It wasn't just that a life had been stolen, but the sheer brutality of the crime, dismemberment, concealment, and betrayal tore through the illusion of safety that Sturgis had clung to for generations. Kelly Warner was the kind of woman whose presence lingered in a room even after she had gone. Born and raised in Michigan, she carried with her a warmth that people remembered most in her smile. The kind of smile that suggested generosity of spirit and kindness. To her friends and family, Kelly was dependable, caring, and loving. She worked hard, she laughed often, and she tried to see the best in people. She wasn't the type to give up on someone easily. And that loyalty, the kind that made her stand by people even when they faltered, would ultimately lead her into the orbit of Wade Allen. Her family spoke of her in affectionate terms, remembering her as someone who would give more than she had if it meant helping someone else. She had her struggles, as all people do, but she faced them with determination. She wanted stability, love, and a future she could build on. She dreamed of a life where she could settle into the comfort of a steady home and a reliable partner. It was a dream many share, but for Kelly, that dream placed her in the path of a man who would shatter everything. Wade Allen was, by contrast, a man marked by contradiction. Born in the same part of Michigan, he carried with him the rough edges of someone who had lived a harder life. At 39 years old, by the time his name became known to the public, Wade was not a stranger to failure. He had a history that made people whisper, a life filled with stops and starts, half-built ambitions that collapsed into disappointment. To some, he was a man trying to find his footing. To others, he was a predator who took advantage of those who trusted him. His relationships were rarely smooth. Wade was the kind of man who projected confidence in public but was riddled with volatility in private. He could be charming when he wanted, persuasive enough to draw people in. But behind closed doors, there were signs of anger, control, and instability. Friends and acquaintances would later recall moments where Wade's temper flared, where he seemed unable to cope with setbacks, where his pride turned into resentment. When Kelly met Wade, she was looking for connection. He offered her attention, the promise of companionship, and perhaps even a sense of being needed. To someone as giving as Kelly, that mattered. She wanted to believe in him, to believe that beneath his rough exterior was a man capable of change. Wade, for his part, knew how to play into those hopes. He could be affectionate, attentive, even tender when it served him. It was enough to convince Kelly that there was something worth holding on to. Their relationship, however, was not simple. Friends noticed changes in Kelly, subtle shifts that suggested tension behind the scenes. She became quieter at times, more cautious in what she shared. Some suspected that Wade's influence was not always healthy, that his volatility was seeping into her life. But in the way so many relationships unfold, those concerns remained unspoken or unanswered. People hoped Kelly would see through Wade if he proved toxic, but they also trusted her to make her own choices. Wade's life at the time was far from stable. He lived in an apartment in Sturgis, a modest space that would later become infamous. Neighbors knew him casually, but not intimately, aware of his presence, but not the full scope of his life. He kept to himself in some ways, but behind that closed door, His relationship with Kelly became the defining factor of both their lives. That be why May 2019. Whatever stability Kelly and Wade might have once shared had begun to unravel. Tensions simmered, arguments surfaced, and beneath it all was Wade's growing instability. The exact details of their final days together are murky, but what is certain is that Wade's control and violence escalated to the point of no return. Kelly, the woman who had once smiled so easily, found herself trapped in a relationship that had turned deadly. The end came swiftly. On May 22, 2019, Sturgis police, acting on a tip, arrived at Wade Allen's apartment. They had reason to believe something terrible had happened, but even seasoned officers could not have prepared themselves for what they were about to find. Inside the apartment, in 2 coolers, they discovered the mutilated remains of Kelly Warner. She had been strangled to death and then dismembered, her body concealed in a way that spoke of both brutality and calculation. The discovery shocked the community, but it was only the beginning of the story. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they began to uncover not only the details of Kelly's death, but the disturbing behavior of Wade Allen in the aftermath. He had not only killed the woman who trusted him, but had attempted to erase her existence through mutilation, as though her life could be stuffed into containers and hidden away. It was a crime so grotesque that even those used to dealing with violence struggled to process it. That Kelly's family received the news with devastation that words could never capture. To lose a loved one is unbearable enough. To lose her in such a violent and degrading way compounded the grief beyond comprehension. Her name, once spoken with love and warmth, now echoed through headlines attached to words like murder and dismemberment. She had been stolen from the world in the most horrifying of ways, and those who loved her were left not only with sorrow but with rage to eye in the weeks after her death. More details would emerge: Wade's confessions to cellmates, his retaliatory assault on another inmate, his eventual plea and sentencing. But in May 2019, all that mattered was that Kelly Warner was gone, her life cut short by a man she had trusted, a man who had destroyed everything she had hoped to build. Sturgis would never forget the day the news broke. For a town used to quiet, the revelation that one of their own had killed and mutilated his girlfriend turned into a wound that would take years to heal. And for Kelly's family, the wound would never close. The morning of May 22, 2019, began like any other in Sturgis, Michigan. It was late spring, the air carrying the warmth of approaching summer, the neighborhoods quiet in the way only small towns can be. But for the officers of the Sturgis Police Department, that morning would mark the beginning of one of the most disturbing discoveries in the town's history. Acting on a tip, they approached the modest apartment where Wade Allen lived. When officers knocked on his door, they did not yet know what they would find inside. The tip they had received suggested foul play, but in small towns, rumors and fears often circulate faster than facts. Still, the sense of unease was palpable as the officers stepped into the building. Wade opened the door and stood there, his demeanor oddly detached, almost flat. He did not protest, did not resist. It was as though part of him already knew what they were about to uncover, as though the game was already over. Inside his apartment, the smell hit first. It was faint but unmistakable, the acrid odor of decomposition that seasoned officers know all too well. The room itself looked ordinary at first glance, cluttered but not unusual. But then the officers saw them, 2 large coolers, sealed, sitting where they did not belong. It was an image so banal in one sense: coolers that might otherwise hold food, drinks, or ice on a summer's day, but in this context, the sight was chilling. When officers opened the coolers, the truth was revealed. Inside were the dismembered remains of Kelly Warner. She had been strangled, killed, and then mutilated by the man she had trusted. Her body, broken into pieces, had been stuffed into the containers as if she were nothing more than something to be hidden away. The horror of it was overwhelming. Even the most experienced officers felt the weight of the discovery, their stomachs churning as they processed what lay before them. Forensic investigators were called in immediately. They documented every inch of the apartment, every trace of evidence that might explain how Kelly's life had ended. Blood evidence told a partial story, as did the marks on Kelly's body. She had not simply died. She had been strangled by Wade, her final moments filled with violence and betrayal. The dismemberment that followed suggested an attempt at concealment, a twisted effort to hide what he had done. But in reality, it only compounded the brutality of the crime. Word spread quickly through the police department, and by the afternoon, Sturgis itself began to buzz with shock. This was not the kind of place where gruesome murders happened. People who had grown up with a sense of safety in their small town now felt that security ripped away. Kelly Warner was not a stranger to the community. People knew her, remembered her smile, her kindness, her generosity. To imagine her life reduced to what officers had found in Wade's apartment was unthinkable. The crime scene photos and the details shared among investigators painted a picture of almost unimaginable cruelty. Kelly's body had been desecrated, her humanity stripped away by the man who had once claimed to care for her. The very act of placing her remains in coolers suggested a calculated decision, not an accident of rage. Wade had killed her, and then he had tried to erase her. When officers questioned Wade, his behavior was strange. He did not break down in tears, nor did he rage or shout. Instead, he maintained an unsettling calm, as if the gravity of what had happened had not penetrated his mind. It was a demeanor that would later haunt those who spoke with him, the sense that Wade Allen felt no remorse, no horror, no recognition of the atrocity he had committed. Kelly's family, meanwhile, received the devastating news with anguish beyond words. Losing her would have been shattering enough, but to learn how she had been killed, how she had been treated afterward, was unbearable. They could not reconcile the Kelly they loved with the reports they were hearing. It felt like an impossible contrast. The woman with the bright smile and giving heart, and the remains stuffed into coolers by a man she had trusted. For Sturgis, the crime became a grim turning point. Neighbors who had once felt safe locking their doors only at night began to double-check them during the day. Parents clutched their children closer. People looked at their partners with questions they had never asked before. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? What red flags do we overlook in the name of love or loyalty? The press descended on the story, turning the quiet town into a place of flashing cameras and probing questions. Headlines carried the words murder and dismemberment, phrases that felt almost too horrific to belong to Sturgis. Reporters interviewed neighbors, friends, and police officers, each trying to piece together how such a crime could have happened in their midst. Investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct the timeline of Kelly's final days. They interviewed Wade's acquaintances, studied his movements, and searched for evidence that might provide a motive. Why had he killed her? Was it an argument turned deadly? A premeditated act of control? The truth was elusive, but what became clear was that Wade had strangled Kelly, and then, in an attempt to hide his crime, mutilated her body. The grotesque details shocked even hardened detectives. As the case unfolded, Wade's behavior became even more disturbing. In jail, he began to talk. He told cellmates that he had strangled Kelly, offering details of the crime in a way that seemed almost boastful. He did not deny what he had done. Instead, he seemed to claim ownership of it. When those cellmates later reported his confessions to authorities, Wade lashed out in retaliation, sexually assaulting one of them in an attempt to reassert control. Even behind bars, he revealed himself to be a man driven by violence and dominance, incapable of remorse. For Kelly's family, every new revelation deepened the wound. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a loved one, and now they had to confront the horror of not only her murder, but the way Wade behaved afterward. There was no closure, no comfort, only the sickening knowledge that the man responsible for her death seemed utterly indifferent to the suffering he had caused. The Sturgis community, too, struggled to move forward. Candlelight vigils were held in Kelly's honor, friends and strangers gathering to remember her life rather than the way it had ended. People shared stories of her kindness, her laughter, her generosity, clinging to the memory of who she truly was. They refused to let her be defined only by Wade's brutality. Yet the image of the coolers in Wade's apartment lingered. It was a detail that spread quickly through news reports and social media, a symbol of the grotesque nature of the crime. For many, it became the defining image of the case. Not just a murder, but a dismemberment, a desecration. It was the kind of detail that sears itself into memory, impossible to shake. By the time the community began to process the initial shock, Wade Allen had already set in motion the next chapter of the story. His confessions, his retaliations, his behavior in jail would ensure that his name remained in headlines. But at the heart of it all was Kelly Warner, a woman whose life had been stolen, whose future had been erased, and whose memory now demanded justice. The question that lingered in every conversation, whispered in every home, was a simple one. How could he? How could a man who had once claimed to love someone kill her so brutally, dismember her, and stuff her into coolers? It was a question without a satisfying answer, one that would haunt the people of Sturgis long after the case moved through the courts. The discovery of Kelly Warner's remains inside Wade Allen's apartment left little doubt in the minds of investigators. The evidence was clear, the crime horrific, and Wade's presence at the center undeniable. But what shocked authorities even more was how Wade carried himself after his arrest. Most murder suspects withdraw, deny, or collapse under questioning. Wade Allen, however, seemed to feed on the attention. His calm, detached demeanor gave the impression of a man not particularly concerned with the gravity of his crimes that in the weeks after his arrest. Wade was placed in jail as investigators built the case against him. It was there, within the walls of confinement, that his personality revealed itself in even darker shades. He spoke to fellow inmates not with remorse, but with a disturbing pride. Wade recounted the night of Kelly's death with an unsettling level of detail. He told them how he had strangled her, how he had watched the life drain from her body. He spoke of her final moments not with sorrow, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing an everyday task. These confessions, whispered through the cold air of the jail, spread quickly. For investigators, it was a gift. Inmates came forward, telling authorities what Wade had said, providing corroboration for what the evidence already suggested. It was one thing to find Kelly's body in coolers, to reconstruct the physical evidence of murder and dismemberment. It was another to have Wade's own words describing the act, his voice woven into the narrative of violence. But Wade was not a man who tolerated betrayal. When he learned that his fellow inmates had reported his confessions to the authorities, he turned violent. In a fit of rage and retaliation, Wade sexually assaulted one of the inmates, punishing him for daring to expose the truth. The act was shocking even in the brutal ecosystem of jail life. It showed that Wade Allen's violence was not confined to Kelly. It was part of who he was, a man who sought dominance, who lashed out when challenged, who used brutality as a means of control. The assault added new charges to Wade's case. Prosecutors now had not only a murder and dismemberment to prove, but also the testimony of an inmate who had been attacked in retaliation. The picture of Wade Allen grew clearer with each passing week. He was not a man who had simply snapped in a moment of rage. He was a man whose violence and cruelty extended beyond his relationship, beyond one victim, into a pattern of behavior defined by dominance and disregard for human life. For Kelly Warner's family, these revelations were unbearable. It was enough to lose Kelly, enough to know she had been strangled and mutilated by the man she loved. To then hear that he had bragged about it in jail, that he had assaulted another person while awaiting trial, was to rub salt into wounds that could never heal. Each headline, each press release, each new piece of evidence reopened the pain. Court proceedings began to move forward, slow in the way the justice system often is. Prosecutors gathered evidence, building a case that left little room for doubt. They had the coolers, the remains, the autopsy reports. They had the inmate testimonies, Wade's own words. They had the assault charges, painting a picture of a man incapable of control. The strategy was not simply to convict Wade Allen of murder, but to show the world who he truly was: a predator, a manipulator, a killer. The courtroom became the stage where Kelly's family's grief was placed on display. They sat in the gallery, silent but resolute, as prosecutors described the horrors their loved one had endured. Each word was like a knife, each description of Kelly's final moments a reminder of how she had been taken. They heard the medical examiner detail the strangulation, the dismemberment. They listened as witnesses recounted Wade's confessions. And they watched Wade Allen sit there, his face often blank, as though none of it mattered. For Kelly's mother, father, siblings, the pain was indescribable. They remembered her laughter, her kindness, her presence at family gatherings. They remembered the small moments, the way she hugged, the way she cared for others, the way she lived with generosity. To reconcile those memories with the reports of her mutilation was almost impossible. In the courtroom, their grief mixed with rage. They wanted Wade Allen to look them in the eyes, to see the devastation he had caused, but often he avoided their gaze, retreating into his cold indifference. Prosecutors spared no detail in laying out the case. They described how Kelly had been strangled, how Wade had concealed her body, how he had spoken casually about the crime to fellow inmates. They detailed the sexual assault in jail, connecting it to a broader pattern of violence. They argued that Wade Allen was a danger to society, a man who could not be allowed freedom again. The defense, as in so many cases, tried to mitigate the damage. They suggested Wade was troubled, that his actions were the result of mental instability, that perhaps his confessions were exaggerated. But the evidence was overwhelming, the details too grotesque to ignore. There was no hiding what he had done, no framing it as anything other than cold-blooded murder. For the people of Sturgis, the courtroom proceedings became a grim spectacle. Reporters filled the seats, cameras captured the family's tears, headlines recounted each day's revelations. The town that had once been quiet and anonymous was now the setting of a story carried across the nation. And at the heart of it all was Kelly Warner, a woman whose life should have been defined by love and kindness, but was instead remembered through the brutality of her death, in the long months between hearings. Kelly's family tried to hold on to her memory. They spoke of her at vigils, shared photos, told stories that reminded people of who she truly was. They refused to let her become just a victim in a headline. They wanted the world to remember Kelly not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. Yet in the courtroom, the reality was unavoidable. Every testimony, every photo, every piece of evidence returned the focus to the brutality of her death and the coldness of the man responsible. Wade Allen became the embodiment of betrayal, the partner who had destroyed the woman who trusted him. And as the trial loomed, it became clear that the community, the family, and the prosecutors all wanted the same thing: to ensure Wade Allen never saw freedom again. By the time the case reached its closing chapter, there was little left to contest. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies damning, and Wade Allen's own behavior had confirmed what investigators already knew. He had strangled Kelly Warner, mutilated her body, and stuffed her remains into coolers in his Sturgis apartment. What had begun as whispers in a small Michigan town had grown into headlines across the nation. In January 2023, Wade Allen entered a plea of no contest to multiple charges. It was a strategic choice. By avoiding a full trial, he prevented Kelly's family from enduring even more graphic testimony, while also sparing himself the risk of a harsher sentence. Yet for Kelly's loved ones, there was no comfort in the plea. A man who had shown no remorse was now taking a shortcut through the justice system. Still, they held on to one thing: he would never walk free again. The charges were laid out starkly. Wade Allen received 39 to 60 years in prison for second-degree homicide, 2 to 5 years for attempted dismemberment and mutilation of a body, and an additional 38 months to 5 years for attempted third-degree criminal sexual conduct following his assault on a fellow inmate. The sentences would be served consecutively, ensuring that even by the most generous calculation, Wade would likely die behind bars. When the judge read the sentence, the courtroom was silent but heavy with emotion. Kelly's family sat together, some with tears, others with expressions of grim relief. They had wanted justice, and in the eyes of the law, justice had been delivered. Yet the truth remained: no sentence could bring Kelly back. No prison term, no number of years could undo the horror of what she had endured. The man who had taken her life might now lose his freedom, but that was small consolation to those who had lost her presence forever. During sentencing, Kelly's family was given the opportunity to speak. Their words carried the rawness of grief, the kind that doesn't fade even after years of waiting. They spoke of Kelly's kindness, her generosity, the way she lit up rooms. They spoke of the pain of losing her, of the nightmares that followed, of the way her absence left holes in their lives that could never be filled. One relative said simply, "We loved her, and he took her from us in the worst way imaginable." Wade Allen listened, but as always, his face betrayed little. He did not break down. He did not apologize in any meaningful way. If anything, his silence was consistent with the indifference he had shown throughout the case. For many, That lack of remorse was almost as chilling as the crime itself. He seemed to exist in a void where empathy could not reach him, where the suffering of others was irrelevant. When he was led out of the courtroom to begin his sentence, the community of Sturgis felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the man who had committed one of the most horrific crimes in the town's history would never return. Sorrow because the damage had already been done. Kelly Warner's life had been extinguished, and no verdict could change that. As the years passed, the case might have faded into the background of Michigan's crime history. But in 2024, it found new life online. The YouTube channel Explore With Us, known for deep dives into chilling true crime cases, released a video about the Wade Allen case. The video, uploaded on June 17, 2024, was a full breakdown of the investigation, complete with body cam footage, police reports, and narrative reconstruction. It pulled viewers into the haunting details, the coolers, the inmate confessions, the sentencing. The video went viral, amassing over 5 million views within weeks. People across the country who had never heard of Sturgis, Michigan, or Kelly Warner were suddenly drawn into the story. The comments section filled with outrage, sympathy, and horror. Viewers spoke of the betrayal, the brutality, the sheer senselessness of the crime. Many expressed anger at Wade's indifference, while others shared sorrow for Kelly. A woman remembered only through the tragedy that ended her life. For Kelly's family, the viral resurgence was bittersweet. On one hand, they were grateful that her name was being spoken, that people across the country were learning her story. On the other hand, they hated that her memory was tied to such gruesome details. They wanted people to remember Kelly for her laughter, her kindness, her warmth, not just the way she had died. Yet the video did something important. It brought the issue of intimate partner violence into the spotlight. Viewers discussed the warning signs, the red flags, the need for stronger protections for women in vulnerable relationships. Kelly's story became more than just a case file. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when violence festers behind closed doors. The cultural fascination with the case revealed something deeper about true crime storytelling. People were not only horrified by the brutality, they were compelled by the questions it raised. How could a man kill the woman he claimed to love? How could a human being desecrate a body, hide it in coolers, and then brag about it in jail? How could someone live with such absence of empathy? These questions haunted viewers as much as they haunted the people of Sturgis. Even as Wade Allen serves his sentence, his name remains a mark of infamy. He is remembered not as a man, but as a monster who destroyed a woman's life and devastated a family. In prison, he will grow older, his world reduced to bars and concrete. But outside, Kelly Warner's name continues to be spoken, in courtrooms, in news articles, in viral videos, and in the hearts of those who loved her. Her legacy is one of resilience. Despite the horror of her death, Kelly's family has ensured she is remembered for her life. They share stories of her kindness, of the joy she brought, of the way she gave of herself. They refuse to let Wade's crime define her entirely. Instead, they focus on keeping her memory alive, reminding the world that Kelly Warner was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman with dreams and love to give. The Wade Allen case remains one of the darkest chapters in Sturgis history, a crime so grotesque that it shocked even seasoned investigators. Yet in the retelling of the story, in the viral resurgence, in the quiet persistence of her family's love, Kelly Warner's humanity shines through. She is not defined by the coolers, the confessions, or the courtroom. She is defined by the love she gave in her lifetime, and by the determination of those who refused to forget her. And so, the story ends where it began, in a small Michigan town where people once thought such horrors could never happen. Sturgis will always carry the scar of May 2019, the day officers opened those coolers and revealed the truth. But it will also carry the memory of Kelly Warner, a woman whose life mattered, whose story endures, and whose legacy reminds us all of the importance of seeing the warning signs, of speaking up, and of protecting the vulnerable before it is too late.